Yeah, fair. So this is actually a really important point because I have often found in the work that I do that people use terms like equality and equity interchangeably, as if they have the same meaning. In fact, they don't have the same meaning, right? There's a really important difference between equality and equity. So if equity is about fairness, the kind of cliff notes of it, all right? I was not a good student in high school, right? I went to high school knowing that basketball was going to be my ticket out of the house. Turns out, even though I was pretty decent, basketball was not going to be my ticket out of the house, all right? So I end up just kind of taking classes. I ran into Mr. Lindsay, fortunately, very early on in my high school career, because I actually moved just to the city to go to play basketball. But he got me involved in speech and debate, and then something, and I'm kind of going fast through this story, but something happened towards the end of my junior year. Mr. Lindsay was the first person to talk to me about going to college. I went to a school of like 4,500 students. There was a lot of students. Of all of the teachers, he was the first and the only to ask me about going to college. Now, it's also the case that he was my only teacher that I've had that was an African-American male. But he talked to me about going to college. And I said, I guess I'm interested, but more than anything, Mr. Lindsay was telling me that I needed to go to college because he thought that I was intelligent. He thought that I held a lot of promise. The problem was, what did I start off by saying? I wasn't a good student, right? So I'm sitting there with, my GPA being like a 2.3, 2.4, something like that. The problem in the state of California is if you don't have a 3.0, you're not even eligible to apply to colleges, some of the public universities, right? So Mr. Lindsay does something with me in the beginning of my senior year. He drags me to all of my teachers from my freshman, sophomore, and junior year where I had gotten C's and D's in, and he makes me sit there with them and work out these agreements, these contracts, where if I do this makeup work, they're gonna change my grade. So I spend the first half of my senior year doing all of this makeup work. It was not fun, all right? I'm doing all of this makeup work just so I could get my GPA up to a 3.0, just to be eligible. So that happens. We applied to UCLA. UCLA is a pretty prestigious university. It's one of the top tier universities. What do you think happened to me when I applied?
Rejected.
I got rejected because we know that eligibility does not mean competitiveness, right? Doesn't mean I'm competitive. There are all of these students that had AP and honors courses. Guess how many I had? 0. I had no AP, no honors classes. So I took that letter to Mr. Lindsay, said, look, I didn't get in. Mr. Lindsay said, that's all right. Guess what we're going to do? We're going to appeal. So we put this appeal letter together. He gets people to write letters for me. I don't even know these people. We send this letter off to UCLA a couple weeks back. They send a letter. What do you think they said to me? Am I accepted or not accepted?
Not accepted.
Not accepted. Again, right? And so I wasn't surprised. Take that to Mr. Lindsay. He says, no problem. We're going to appeal again. Long story short, I go through 3 appeals, and then I finally get admitted to UCLA. Wow. Finally. And I was the only kid out of, again, my senior class, maybe like 900 students. I was one of 6 students that was admitted to UCLA. So there were a couple of things that happened to me. One, I was really excited, and then almost immediately I was terrified. Terrified, because now I'm going to a place like UCLA, which is in my mind where only smart people go, right? All the kids that were in AP classes, honors classes, and I just knew that I didn't have it. But Mr. Lindsay thought I did, and he encouraged me. So there's a much more to this story, but I would say I did a couple things early on in my career at UCLA. I kept my mouth shut because I was worried someone was going to identify me as not being smart, and they were going to kick me out. Right? And then I also just was really observant. If you've ever been to a really fancy dinner where there's like 4 different kinds of forks and spoons and things like that, and the first time you go, you don't know what to do, right? So you just watch what other people do. That's exactly what I did my first couple of years at UCLA. People were like, oh, we're going to go to office hours. Like, I will also go to office hours, right? Or we're going to go to the library and study. That sounds like a great idea. I'm going to do that also, right? I'm just copying other people. But I ended up being pretty successful at UCLA. And I stayed through there, was able to get scholarships. I did well. I stayed there, went straight into a PhD program in education, and after I got my PhD, I came to Michigan State University. But that entire experience really prompted for me to ask some questions. One, why was it so difficult for me to have some kinds of more positive experiences in my K-12 schooling experience? What was it about Mr. Lindsay that really kind of transformed and connected with me such that my outcome was dramatically different than had I not had the opportunity to interact with Mr. Lindsay. So I'm in this position now where I am now a person who teaches future educators, which is interesting because I mostly did not have positive experiences with educators, right? And if you look at my dissertation, there's actually not much that is said about teachers. But I focus on identity development. I focus on issues of race, class, gender, and issues of equity in education. And that's what I get to talk to future educators about. I get to have them ask these questions about what's going on in our society, how does that impact our schools, and where are the issues around equity that may be disproportionately affecting some communities in a negative way, right? So one of the questions that I ask my students is, do we think schools are doing what they're supposed to do? So I want to hear from some of the students that are here. Do we think that schools are doing what they're supposed to do? Just broadly speaking?
For the most part.
For the most part? What makes you say for the most part?
I mean, it works for me.
Works for you, got you. So it's mostly working, I got you. Anybody have a different opinion?
Kind of.
What do you think?
Kind of just for the fact that, some teachers are great, they do what they gotta do.
Yeah.
But then there are some that just don't, like, they really don't do what they're supposed to do. So
I got you.
So how will they be beneficial for me so that I can be
So we have some issues with like the quality of teaching and maybe the relationships that young folks have with teachers, right? Thinking about how students connected. If we were to look at the nation though, does anybody have a sense of like what the graduation rate is broadly, like how we're performing in mathematics and all these other things? Are we doing, is our education system like at the top of the world?
No.
No. So
26.
so let me ask that question again. Do you think our schools are doing what they're supposed to do? No? It's an interesting prospect because most of my students will say no, right? But then I ask them, well, what if they are? What if schools are doing exactly what they're supposed to do? And I do that coupled with this picture. This is just a theory, a framework, right? I'm going to test this out with you all. I'm trying to be mindful of how much time I have. Let's say that our society looks like this. At the bottom, the base of this pyramid, the wider it is, it means there's more people there. At the top, the pinnacle of that pyramid, that means there's fewer people there. But if we looked at the kind of up and down, if the bottom of this pyramid were low income and the top of the pyramid were high income, how many people would agree that our society might look something like this? Which means there are some very few people at the top of the pyramid that have lots of resources, lots of money, and there are significantly more people at the bottom of the pyramid who don't have lots of resources, don't have lots of opportunities. How many people would agree that our society kind of looks like this? Okay. So it's a lot of people, right? So I asked them, well, what if our schools are meant to make sure that our society continues to look this way? What if we build into our schools certain kinds of systems and structures that say, you know what, some of you kids are gifted and talented and are on your way, and others, well, you're doing all right. And when we look beyond even just what's going on in specific schools and we look at schools compared to other schools, we might see that there are some schools, sometimes in rural communities or in urban communities where they have very few resources, where graduation rates are really bad, where they don't have a lot of positive experiences with teachers. Teachers are stressed out because they don't have planning periods, they have classrooms with 40, 50 students, right? Maybe those kinds of schools and those structures within schools are meant to replicate this society. People might say, well, yeah, that doesn't seem right, right? But we still have this continuing to happen. Another question I ask my students is, all right, let's imagine that you are a person that's down here. What's the only thing preventing you from looking at those people who might live in Beverly Hills and be like, you know what, I like that, I'm gonna go and just take that? Opportunities, I hear you. What else? Police maybe, right? Be like, hey, get back over there. You can't be just taking people's stuff, right? You can't do that, right? I propose something else. I say, what about this idea of meritocracy? Meritocracy is the idea that if you work hard, you will succeed. Does that make sense? That's a boiling down of this idea of meritocracy. You've got to get everybody in this system, or at least most people in this system, to believe in meritocracy to allow this to continue to happen. You got to get the people down here to believe that they and others are down here because they don't deserve to be at the top. And you got to get the people at the top to believe that those at the bottom aren't at the top because they don't work hard. But you and I know that there are people at the top that aren't really working hard, right? And y'all know some people that might be down here that work really hard. Right? But you got to believe in this idea that if I work hard, then I can succeed, right? So these are the kinds of structures that we have to talk about in my class. There are a couple of principles that I try to get my students to think about in a class that I teach, right? Because sometimes it's uneasy for them to think about these kinds of structures and systems, because when I start questioning issues about like meritocracy, some of my students get really upset and uncomfortable, right? Because we've been told our entire lives, this is how our society works. All you got to do is work hard, things will get better. But that doesn't work out for some people. We have some kind of cognitive dissonance there, right? And so we can spend a lot of time in my class talking about the structures and systems that disproportionately advantage some and disadvantage others. But one of the biggest things that I have to do in my class is I have to get my students to think about themselves. They got to think about who they are and what are the beliefs that they have and how that might impact the kinds of practices that they engage in when they become teachers in the future. So there are some principles. One of the first ones I'll point out is this idea, sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? Sometimes we use anecdotal evidence to kind of use as the evidence to make our arguments when maybe that isn't necessarily based in kind of the research and the facts. But I also turn to people like Beverly Daniel Tatum. Beverly Daniel Tatum is an educator. She wrote this amazing book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, right? She did this activity with her students, and essentially, and over the course of her research, she came up with a couple of ideas. One of the things that she says is that people have an aversion to acknowledging their dominant status. If you are in a privileged position, sometimes you don't want to be told that you are privileged. Why? Because let's remember the meritocracy, we have to believe that we are doing well because we worked hard, right? I get uncomfortable if someone starts talking about how men get paid more than women, even though it is a fact that I get paid more than some of the female colleagues in my department. Do I want to have that conversation? Nah, not really. It makes me uncomfortable, right? But it's the fact, right? The other thing that she says is that dominant groups set the parameters within which subordinate groups operate. It is almost always the case that people that have the most power get to set the rules. So that if you are not in the group that has power, guess who's telling you how you're supposed to act, how you're supposed to talk? Rationalizations have been used to justify social arrangements. All right, just in the interest of time, I can't get into this kind of schema activity, but when I ask my students to kind of think about certain things like if we were all to close our eyes and if I said one word to you, what would be the image that popped into your mind? And I do this with all my students. I ask them, all right, tell me what your athlete looks like, right? Students close their eyes, and when we talk about it, lots of them tend to talk about men. They talk about folks that are folks of color, mostly African American. They're talking about physically fit, even though we know that there are athletes who don't look like that, right? We know that there are women athletes. We know that there are athletes that are in wheelchairs. We know all these things, but these are not the things that pop into our mind. I ask them to think about the term professor. Guess what their professor looks like? Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, disheveled hair, white guy, glasses, he's got patches on his coat, right? That's his professor, right? And I tell them that's exactly who my professor looks like, even though I'm a professor. And I don't think of myself, I think of Bernie Sanders, right? So I asked them, where did all these ideas come from? And so we turn to Bobby Hero, who talks to us about this thing called the cycle of socialization. And really quickly, basically, Bobby Hero says that when we are born into this world, we don't have any biases. We're not discriminatory towards any group. We don't come out of the womb saying, I can't stand Italians. It's not how it is. But she says that we are socialized from the people that are closest to us. Our parents, our caregivers, they gave us subtle kinds of messages, right? So let's say that a new child is born in your family. What's one of the first questions you ask? Is it a boy or a girl? Why? Because you got to know if you're going to get blue clothes and pink clothes, right? You got to know if you're going to get the action figures or if you're going to get the dolls. No one wrote down that these are the actual rules, even though maybe you might go into a store and it says boys' toys or something like that, right? But it's not the law. But we all subscribe to these ideas, right? We all, and sometimes it's as simple as our parents saying we don't play with those people, right? Sometimes the boys don't kiss other boys. We receive messages that tell us what things are normal and good and what things are not normal and what are not good. It doesn't just stop there. Hero says that these messages are reinforced in institutions, right? In television, in media, in schools. These ideas get reinforced. I'm gonna wrap up with this really provocative question. But here's the question that I have that I think is really connected to this issue of equity and inclusion, right? What's the difference between crack and cocaine?
Yeah.
Sentencing.
Sentencing, right? But what's really the difference?
White and black
Users, right? But when we're talking about crack and cocaine, we are essentially talking about the same drug. One is just less pure and cheap. Cocaine is more pure and costs more. That's the only difference between these. You're going to go into affluent white communities and you're going to see more cocaine. You're going to go into poor communities of color and you're going to see crack. They're the same drug though, but we have written into law that if you get found with one drug, it's a lighter sentence for cocaine. And it's a harsher sentence for crack. And it's a way that our policy tells us that poor people, people of color, that they are not worth as much as certain other communities. These are ways institutions reinforce certain ideas, and we don't even know it sometimes, right? So we have to start asking these questions, and we have to look at ourselves. And sometimes it's because we don't know that these things are actually going on. But as people prepare to be future teachers, there are some great folks that talk about what it takes to be an educator. Somebody like Lisa Delpit says that you have to believe in all children. Well, here's the thing. If you're not aware of who you are and what your biases might be, you might not even know that you don't believe in all children. Does that make sense? Right? She says you gotta fight foolishness. You gotta have high expectations for folks. Well, you gotta be aware that you have lower expectations for folks so that you can have high expectations for folks. We're not talking about sameness here, right? We're talking about issues of justice and fairness, right? Lisa Delpit also goes on to say that you got to learn who children are. We got to stop buying into these stereotypes that exist about communities. We got to get to know who kids are. And if we spend so much time thinking that we know groups of people based on limited information, then we're going to be missing out on a lot of folks. It is always the case that I have way more slides and way more to say than the actual time that I have. But if there are questions that people have or ways that I can be more helpful as you start to think about these issues around equity in our society, particularly as we talk about folks of color, then please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm really excited that we have some time for question and answer. So this is not the time to hold back, folks. I really encourage my students to ask the difficult questions because I think it's entirely okay for us to be uneasy with trying to figure out some of the answers. And I think that's actually the only place where people really start to learn things. So that said, I will conclude my presentation, but I would love to hear from you all, to hear whatever questions that you have.
Agreed. This is where the learning really takes place, so now is your time to ask some questions. I have 20 of them, but I'm going to wait until after an opportunity to play.
So is the class that you teach, is that for bachelor level students, is it a required class?
It is a required class for students that want to enter our teacher preparation program.
Oh, okay.
So these are undergraduate students. More often than not, I am teaching students that are freshmen, but it ends up being the case that I get students that are at the junior, sophomore, senior level. I'm going to have an order on that, but yes. I've actually been in conversation with graduate students who say that they wish that this was a part of their graduate requirements as well. But it is one class out of a lot of classes, right? And one of the things that I tell my students is that I can't transform how they think and who they are in the semester that I have them. The best that I can do is try to make them uncomfortable and inquisitive, get them to realize how little they know about the world, right? And just to start a conversation, So that's what happens.
I'm
Please.
curious, have you ever gone and talked with school districts?
Yes.
And spoken with teachers within the school district to give a refresher course, say, to teachers who have been teaching for a while?
Yeah.
And,
I actually get, I'm gonna be real with you. I get paid to go to these places and have these conversations with people, right? And there is no shortage of work for me in Michigan. right? There are lots of school districts that are trying to figure out what do we do with these kids that aren't doing well, right? And they're just like, these kids aren't doing this, these kids aren't doing this. And I try to come in and say, what are y'all doing and not doing it, right? Like, what are the schools doing? What are the teachers maybe? What is it that we could do more, right? What are ways that principals could support their teachers even more in some of this work, right? So yes, I have no shortage of opportunities to go to school districts, but it ends up being the case that for many educators, this kind of strand of the work and thinking about the profession in this way is not emphasized in a lot of teacher education programs. And I would venture to say that while this is extremely important to me, and we at Michigan State University are trying to do more to make sure that this is a part of all of the classes that students are taking, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that this is really sinking in with our teachers. And then, key to your point is that Michigan State, as well as other folks, we got to do better about supporting teachers while they are in the profession as well. We can't just say, here's a class, hope you remember it when you become a teacher, because sometimes when you are a classroom teacher, you get smacked in the face with the reality of being a teacher when you get into these schools. And so we've got to be better in terms of ongoing support for educators. Yeah. I saw that there was a hand over here, and I know that some folks are here. And my students, I'm going to go right to y'all if I see one of your hands shoot up, okay? Yes?
I don't really know what my question is, so I'll try to work through it here. But I work at MSU now, but I was teaching at Grand Ledge. I'm not from Michigan, so the schools of choice thing was new to me when I came to Michigan. But something always bothered me, made me really uncomfortable, and I couldn't quite frame it. But lunchroom conversation, break room conversation. I would hear teachers say things about, oh, she's a school of choice child.
Yes.
And it was almost always coded for Black and from Lansing.
Yes.
And it just, they're not saying that.
Yep.
They say, oh, he or she is a schools of choice kid, and that just wrote off why their score wasn't as good,
Yep.
or why their class wasn't doing as well, or something like that. And I just wonder if there's any research about this, or if you can speak to that. It just bothered me, and I couldn't quite. I don't know if I wasn't brave enough or what.
No, and I mean this is something that happens, and Michigan is a unique context in some ways, but not so much in others. I've been in places where they call them apartment kids. I've been in places where they call them Detroit kids. It's all of these coded terms for, we're talking about low income sometimes and kids of color, right? And there, in terms of the scholarship that's examining that specific to Michigan, there isn't a ton, but we have no shortage of evidence and scholarship that lets us know that teachers have differential expectations for students based on social identity markers, and that this has an impact on how they engage with students and the actual academic outcome for students.
And it's connected to the test scores, right? Because it's almost always justifying why maybe our evaluations weren't as good this time.
I mean, there is, yes, that's the short answer. Yeah, that's the short answer. But I would say that it's been interesting for me to be reminded that for some of my students that are in my class, I have to remind myself sometimes that these are kids that for their entire education, they have been in No Child Left Behind. And that means that they have been tested and tested and tested and tested. And it's also been the case that these kinds of accountability measures have been put in place with no resources added to make sure that students are being able to, it's like this equality framework for an equity issue. You know what I'm saying? And so that has been, I think, really detrimental just to the dialogue of what's going on in schools and how it is that we can meet the needs of students in better ways. Yes?
Yeah, I will start by saying that last year I had the opportunity to go with Dr. Flennaugh and the urban cohort to Chicago, and that was really a very good experience in terms of eyes opening of seeing the reality that is in the reality in the classroom, the reality in the urban areas. Yeah. I'm also involved in teaching some of the courses as an instructor, the TESOL and the world language courses, and then we use a lot we use Delpit, we code Delpit a lot. And then one of the things that Delpit has inspired to do is to get the intern teachers to have, in their first weeks, a kind of the language landscape of the area in which they are placed. See, identify what languages the people there in the community speak and what languages are accepted inside the school and inside the classroom. Because that is also one of, for example, the challenges that the teachers and some of the students have in
when I was telling you, think of professor, think of athlete, one of the ones that I also ask is, I say, American. And American for many of my students, looks a certain way and sounds a certain way,
Yeah.
right? And we have to interrogate, well, what does that mean if, you know, if certain groups are thought to be native here and others who aren't, even though we all look a certain kind of way, right? So there's a lot to be said there, but yes, the way that we speak is an extension of who we are, and if we are not accepting the way that kids speak in their classroom, if we are constantly correcting their language, then it's not just that they're thinking that their language is wrong, they're starting to feel like they're wrong.
They're wrong.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm
So-
looking at the high school
right.
students. I'm like, which one of y'all want to say anything?
All right. So the notion of inequality and inequity like has been happening like so many years, like 100 years,
Yes. Mhm.
right? And so many professors has already done some research, you know, articles has been published, but then this problem is still exists,
Yeah.
right? And I heard from, you know, like I remember the conversation that I did with my friend. This is because we teach more differences rather than we teach on similarity that we have among people. Is that true, or you don't agree with that? Because in other hand, like when you say there is no difference, then you are actually like discriminating. You know,
Yeah.
when you see when you are
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like no
Yeah.
color blindness is actually
Right.
not good.
When the emphasis is on sameness, then we don't start to understand and respect the differences that exist
Right.
and why they're important.
Right.
But I would also say that much of what's been happening in education is that we've just been getting really incomplete stories, incomplete stories about different groups, right? So if I were really pressed to think about the ways in which I learned about the legacy and contributions of Black people in the United States, I'm thinking like, well, there was that one week in February where, we talked a little bit about Martin Luther King, and maybe we read Beloved, right? But outside of that, I was reading about a lot of white old guys that had lots of money and like all the contributions that they made to society. And if we start to, if we recognize that we've been in a context in schools where for 12 years we've just been learning about all these wonderful things that white men who have lots of money have been doing, then can we be that surprised that we sometimes struggle to find the humanity in people that look like something different, right? So I would say that part of what we should always endeavor to do is find ways that we can tell more complete, more complex stories about people and communities so that we can understand just how complex our society is and all the opportunities that exist to make it better.
Unfortunately, I'm a bad guy here.
That's it.
I'm going to unfortunately have to put an end to this, or to put this off to continue perhaps a little bit later. If Terry can stick around and we have lunch and you can kind of talk a little bit, with him. His stuff is up here. I've already written down,